Hi, buddy. My name's Jim. I'm an alcoholic. I'm glad to be here. Glad to see all of you here. As I guess you figured out by now, our joke maven, Audrey, has not been here for 3 weeks. And she was keeping us pretty well enlightened with lawyer jokes. And I get to tell them because I'm a lawyer, so I can tell them on myself. And we had some fun with that. But I was thinking, there's kind of a corollary to one of our principles. The principle is that we are not ever to hurt another person. And but there's a corollary to that. We're not to allow other people to hurt us. Did you ever think about that? When other people are hurting us, what's happening to us? There's a very good chance we're getting blocked off from God because of it. We don't permit that to happen. So we have to learn to say, stop right there. No, we'll have none of this. But there's another little sign. It's not what you're thinking. That has some effectiveness. But I got to tell you how it came about. You see, there was this old Italian fellow, and he was on his deathbed. And the doctor had been and gone, and the priest had been and gone. And the family was gathered around out in the living room. And the son turned to the daughter and he said, "Sis, one of us has got to ask Papa. Got to ask him, because if we don't, he might die and we'll never know." And the sister says, "Oh, sure. Why don't you go ask him?" So he walked in and he said, Papa, we're so sorry that you're dying. But I got to ask you something. We know you have a lot of money, but you never told us where you keep it. Won't you please tell me where you keep all your money?" And the old boy kind of raised up off his deathbed and he went, well, the son was flabbergasted. He didn't know what the heck this was. He went back out. He said, "Sis, I don't know what's going on. You go ask him." So the daughter went in and she said, Papa, I'm so sorry you're dying. We know you have a lot of money, but you never told us where you keep it. Won't you please tell me? She's mystified. She goes out, "I don't know." Well, about this time, there was this great flash of light, and the angel Gabriel appeared in the bedroom, reached out with his golden wings and reached across, and he touched the old man on his temples. Boom! Miraculous recovery. And he got up and he walked out of his bed and he walked out into the living room. Oh boy, all pandemonium broke loose and everybody was crying and blessing the Virgin and doing all this stuff. And after they settled down, the son said, "Papa, we're so mystified. We don't know what you meant. Because when Sis and I ask you, where do you keep all your money? Won't you please tell us? You just went like this. What did you mean by that?" He says, "I was a too sick to do it this." Got it? Remember that when people are picking on you? You know what the greatest comeback of all is? That's it. You all looking at me for it. If you have to say something, say, "Okay." Or, this is a pretty good one too. "Hey, that's very interesting." But then you got to be willing to drop it, Because people will pick on you as long as you respond. And the way to turn that aside is to say, that's very interesting. Pretty soon they get tired of the game. "Okay, guys, We've been reading the big book together and studying it and figuring out where everything is in the book and how it all ties together with everything else. And we got into chapter 8, the chapter of the wives, that chapter that is sort of forgotten territory in the big book with a lot of us. And we found a tremendous amount in this book, in this chapter. In fact, I think we've probably been studying it now for maybe 5-6 weeks, which is about par for the course. This chapter contains material found nowhere else in the big book, in great detail, and it's very, very, very important. We also keep in mind that part of the importance of this chapter is the fact that the chapter is telling the wives what to expect of their husbands who are still drinking. And in doing so, it's describing us. So chapter 8 is great first step material. It's the kind of thing that newcomers ought to be reading because they're going to find themselves in here. And it is the only place in the big book where the progression of the disease of alcoholism is discussed in great detail. In fact, it's the only place in the big book where the progression of alcoholism is described at all, with the exception of in Bill's story, where there it's not delineated as such, but we get to watch Bill as he goes through the various stages of the development of the disease. But here it's set out clearly so that we can watch these various stages and we can identify ourselves as fitting in somewhere in this continuum of the development of the disease, the progression. In another couple of pages we're going to come to another very critical part of the 8th chapter, a part that describes for us something that we're going to be literally living with the rest of our lives. What is it that's wrong with all the rest of those people out there? You think I'm kidding? I'm not. There's some serious problems out there. They don't have anything to do with alcoholism or drug addiction, probably. They may, but they probably don't. But all these defects are out there. And in every day of our lives, we have to deal with this. It's going to describe this to us and show us that there is a solution for those folks too. As a matter of fact, this chapter would be considered, at least by me, to be the chapter which lays down the rule that the 12 steps are for everybody. And as a matter of fact, 12 steps are being used many, many times, many hundreds, maybe thousands of times these days, by people who are not admitted alcoholics or addicts or nail biters or lint pickers or nose pickers or any of that stuff. You know, they're just people who have discovered for themselves that they're dealing and suffering with the same defects of character that we have, and that their lives are a mess and wanting some help. Now, if we turn to page 113 in our book, we're right near the end now of the description of the progression of the illness, and let's go to the middle of the page. Remember that we have already read about husband number 3, the third stage. As a matter of fact, if you go back to page 109, you will find that husband number 3 at the bottom of the page is set forth, and the book's going to talk a little bit more about this guy, that this husband's gone much further than husband number 2, and though much like number 2, he became worse, and his friends have slipped away, and so on and so on. Now let's see what it tells us on page 113 about this same guy. If you have a number 3 husband, this is the middle paragraph on page 113, you may be in luck. Boy, it's going to be hard to see. This is a real drunk. Being certain he wants to stop, you can go to him with this volume as joyfully as though you had struck oil. He may not share your enthusiasm, but he's practically sure to read the book. And he may go for the program at once. These guys had a great deal of faith in this book, you know. It was interesting when Jay was announcing this institutions thing, and Diane asked him if she could participate, and she doesn't have a year sober yet. I wonder if the people who set that up really even know that more than half of the folks who helped to write the big book weren't sober a year yet. And many of them weren't sober 6 months yet. And yet their experience is what has guided the rest of us to sobriety. Now there's something wrong there. I'm not quite sure what it is, but sometimes we lose a lot of perspective, and we get a little power. And we get to sit down in a committee and we get to, somebody says, well, it's got to have at least a year. And nobody says, why? What the hell does that mean, a year? There are people who have their steps behind them and they're sponsoring people by the time they're 3 or 4 months sober. Well, they can sponsor people, but they can't come to an institution and share their story. Balderdash. See, it's got nothing to do with years. I know people with 10 years supposed sobriety. I wouldn't let them anywhere near an institution, because they're not really sober. They're walking around with untreated alcoholism, and they're full of all kinds of poisonous ideas. They're only going to push other people in front of buses. So that's not a criteria at all. 1 year. Sometimes I think we fail to stop and think what we're doing. You may not share your enthusiasm. That's pretty much a lead pipe cinch. But he's practically sure to read the book, and he may go for the program at once. Now, remember that when these guys wrote this book, there was no other way that they had to reach the people out there in Cucamonga and St. Louis and all these other places. There's no AA out there. And a few of them were wandering through New York and Akron and Cleveland. They came in contact with the groups there, and some of them had some exposure to the program. But they realized that the only way that this program was ever going to get out there and have any widespread acceptance and impact and effect on people around the country, around the world, was to write the book. And they were full of enthusiasm themselves for this book. They felt that what they had done was to write a book which would accomplish 2 major objectives. One, that it would help the newcomer to break down the walls of denial. It's critically important, as we all know, because this is a disease of denial. So long as we continue to deny the existence of the disease in us, there's no way we recover. It's the only deadly, incurable illness I know of which denies its own existence. The other thing the Big Book was designed to do was to bring hope. Because this book is a positive book that says there is a solution. That this is how it works. And these are the actions we take. And we work with each other, and then the promises. And everything in this book is pointed toward recovery. And it is a book of optimism and hope for every afflicted person. And that's what they believed. And so when the book was written, they were very enthusiastic about it, its acceptance. And well, they should have been, because it was accepted almost immediately. If he does not go for the program at once, you will probably not have long to wait. Again, you should not crowd him. Let him decide for himself. Cheerfully see him through more sprees. Talk about his condition or this book only when he raises the issue. In some cases, it may be better let someone outside the family present the book. They can urge action without arousing hostility. If your husband is otherwise a normal individual, your chances are good at this stage. There's another kind of interesting aspect to this last paragraph, because you see what it's assuming is that the wife has picked up this book, has been exposed to this book, is reading this book, and is being advised by this book as to how she is to be most helpful to her husband. Remember back in the 7th chapter when we were reading about how to work with a newcomer? Remember that the instruction there is that we give them the book and tell them to read the book. Not part of the book, the whole book. But we're not to crowd him, not to nag him. And the rule is, if he is to find God, the desire must come from within. We are not to try to force anybody to accept a spiritual way of life. Now, of course, the tendency is that we're getting so frustrated and we're so upset and we're so hurt. We want to force the issue. Stop drinking, for God's sakes. What's the matter with you? That doesn't work. All of you guys know that. It doesn't work. And so there's something that has to go on in the mind of the afflicted person. If he is to find God, the desire must come from within. And here it says again, you should not crowd him. Let him decide for himself. Now this is pretty tough medicine. To be put in a book and then expecting the wife, who's been suffering for years and years with this guy, to read this and understand it and act upon it. It really goes against all the things that we've been taught. It goes against human nature. I want him to stop. Look at what he's doing. I've been so patient. I've seen him through all of his binges, and I've lied for him, and I've scrimped for him, and I'm doing I have to take care of the family, and I have to do all the work and pay all the bills, and he keeps out on drinking. Why in the world can't I just go to him and say, you must stop. Look what you're doing to your family. Dr. Silkworth answered this question clear back in his opinion, remember? He said that frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices. That the message which will interest these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. Depth and weight is exactly what our program of the 12 Steps has, because it is a spiritual program dealing with spiritual issues and the complete change in a person's life. Complete change. Everything changes. And then the book goes back and reprises at the bottom of page 113 the 4th classification. This, remember, when we were going through this a couple of weeks ago. These are the guys. This is the guy who's real down and outer. This is the dumpster dweller, dumpster diver, under the bridge liver. The guy who's nuts. The guy who's maybe been chained down in a bed. Maybe spent a lot of time in prison. This is the real down and outer. This is the Skid Row bum. And so this is the guy that everybody's given up on. This is the guy that if he wandered into the average hospital, he'd stink up the emergency room and they'd pump him full of something and try to get rid of him as soon as possible. Their experience tells them there's not a thing in the world they can do for him except maybe to save his life. And there are people, perhaps even in this group, who have been there. It's a terrible place. It's hell. Absolute hell. Because there's a human being living inside of all those rags and all that dirt, that smell. Human being screaming for help. How many times in your own experience have you seen somebody wander in the door looking like that, kind of sit in the back room, go over and grab a cup of coffee and shaking hands, scarf it down? How many times does anybody go up to him after the meeting and give him a hug? Say, what can I do to help you? And yet that is exactly what we ought to be doing. Even though we know that it is virtually hopeless. but is not entirely hopeless. And every once in a while, one of those people makes it. And you never know which one it's going to be. And it isn't up to us to try to figure that out. So we go. You would suppose that men in the fourth classification would be quite hopeless, but that is not so. Many of Alcoholics Anonymous were like that. Everybody had given them up. Defeat seemed certain. But yet often such men have had spectacular and powerful recoveries. There are exceptions. Some men have been so impaired by alcohol they cannot stop. Sometimes there are cases where alcoholism is complicated by other disorders. Well, that's pretty common, isn't it? A good doctor or psychiatrist can tell you whether these complications are serious. In any event, try to have your husband read this book. His reaction may be one of enthusiasm. If he's already committed to an institution but can convince you and your doctor that he means business, give him a chance to try our method. Unless the doctor thinks his mental condition too abnormal or dangerous. We make this recommendation with some confidence. For years we've been working with alcoholics committed to institutions. Since this book was first published, AA has released thousands of alcoholics from asylums and hospitals of every kind. The majority have never returned. The power of God goes deep. You know, that's another point, isn't it? One of the things that seems to be prevalent these days is kind of a mocking of God and God's power. We like to be modern and a little sophisticated, a little bit cynical. Everybody seems to admire us for doing that, as if we're really pretty smart. To do that, we have to voice our doubt as to how far God's going to go with us. Most commonly now we see this in the modern teachings of the New Age AA people, that which tend to shed a lot of doubt on whether God is going to remove our defects of character. And it's become very commonplace these days to proclaim loudly that God doesn't take away all our defects. And then one of the more scurrilous of the pronouncements is God has a sense of humor, which then explains why he plays all these tricks on little old me. But you see, here's the problem. God's power is unlimited. As a matter of fact, I think it's pretty obvious, isn't it? Because when we took our second step, we came precisely to that conclusion, didn't we? That there is indeed a God. God's either everything or he's nothing. And we agreed that God is everything. And we agreed that God had the power to restore us to sanity. Does not that cover every aspect of the restoration to sanity? Clear back in the second step, we're willing to say so. But then we get very sophisticated and very smart, kind of smart-mouthed. We like all these slogans and all this stuff. And then we say, well, God doesn't take away all our defects. We got to work on them. But you see, there's a problem with that. Because back in the fourth and fifth step, we found out that we couldn't work on them. How can you work on something over which you have no power? It doesn't make sense. The big book makes no bones about it. In the sixth step, we're ready to have God remove all these defects. And if we're not ready to have him remove all our defects, we pray for the willingness until it comes. And in the seventh step, we ask God to take away all our defects of character that stand between us and him, and our usefulness to him and our fellows. In the very next page, it tells us why we're doing this. that our real purpose here is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people about us. That doesn't have any corners being cut. There's no weasel words there. And every time we do this, what we do is limit God's ability to work in our lives, because His power is unlimited. But you see, the only way it's going to be helpful to us is if we accept it. And the moment we begin to doubt, the moment that we begin to put up all these smart-ass things that we talk about as if we know better, what we do, only result of this is that we limit God's ability to act in our lives. We short-circuit ourselves that way. And the same thing here with this guy. Why this number 4 husband, this down and outer? This guy only appears to be hopeless. The truth is that nobody's hopeless. Somewhere along the line, if there's some kind of a spark, if this person, no matter how far he's gone down or she's gone down, if somehow the spark should ignite in them and they should be willing to seek God, the power is there for them just exactly the same way it was there for us. No difference. And sometimes these folks come roaring up out of the grave. They're reborn. I've seen this over and over and over and over again. One of my most favorite people in this whole world was 8 years ago, living in that kind of life down on 79th Street. You should see her today. A more magnificent lady you'll never meet. And everybody had given up on her. She was a goner. Everybody but God. She got the spark. Something happened in her that told her, yes, just do it. She did it. I have great, great, great admiration for that lady. I don't have any doubts about this next statement. This program requires guts. It is not a program for sissies. And people who don't have the courage to face themselves will never make it, of course. But all we need, if we have that courage, and remember every time we hear chapter 5 being read, because that's what it's giving us the bottom line. People who don't recover are those who are unable or constitutionally unable to be honest with themselves. But if there is that spark, then there is that hope. And there are so many examples now of recovery from the bottom of the barrel that we can no longer doubt it at all. Goes on to talk about the husband who is perhaps completely beyond hope. You may have the reverse situation in your hands. Perhaps you have a husband who is at large, but who should be committed. Some men cannot or will not get over alcoholism. That's the truth too. But you notice the cannot here doesn't have anything to do with God's ability. It has to do with their willingness to accept a spiritual way of life. They cannot get to that point, and they will not. When they become too dangerous, we think the kind thing is to lock them up. But of course, a good doctor should always be consulted. I wonder, this book is always so generous. It keeps talking about good doctors and good psychiatrists. I guess there's some around, I don't know. The wives and children of such men suffer horribly, but not more than the men themselves. Now, that's a very important statement, that last sentence, isn't it? Look at it from the standpoint of what's going on with these guys. They are in hell. Alcoholic died, went to heaven. St. Peter, he did tell. You've got to let me in, Pete. I have already been to hell. But sometimes, talking to the wife now, you must start life anew. We know women who have done it. If such women adopt a spiritual way of life, their road will be smoother. Here we go. See now, this is the opening salvo, right here, of what is going to become a major appeal throughout the rest of this chapter and then carried forward into the 9th chapter of the family afterward. This whole idea that not only the alcoholic, but all the members of the family need to be on a spiritual path. And this is not something they just imagined. It's not a bunch of opinion or anything, it's true. And they found it out in the 3 years before they wrote this book. They saw it happening in their own families. And that's why it makes such a big point of it. They found out that 12 steps are for everybody. They found out that those who work the 12 steps have this tremendous change in their lives. And that anybody who is willing to work the steps will have a spiritual awakening. And they too will have a new rebirth. Going on at the bottom, page 114, if your husband is a drinker, you probably worry over what other people are thinking. And you hate to meet your friends. You draw more and more into yourself, and you think everyone is talking about conditions at your home. You avoid the subject of drinking, even with your own parents. You do not know what to tell the children. When your husband is bad, you become a trembling recluse, wishing the telephone had never been invented. Speaking of that, I often wondered if God waited until we had telephones before He gave us the 12 steps. I don't know how the AA would have flourished without the phone. And how would we do it today? Everybody's is connected to some kind of umbilical cord these days. Used to be beepers, didn't it? I haven't seen a beeper around a long time. Beep, beep, beep. Oh, what do you want now? Gosh. Anyway, at any time of the day or night, somebody's going to decide it's time for you to be contacted. We find that most of this embarrassment is unnecessary. While you need not discuss your husband at length, you can quietly let your friends know the nature of his illness. But you must be on guard not to embarrass or harm your husband. Now that's a big order. And it kind of assumes something which is definitely not in evidence here, that the people we try to explain this to are going to understand at all. You know how difficult it is? I guess most of you do. You've got family and friends and people who you tried to explain to them what's going on with you, and sure, they'll say, oh, I understand. Then you begin to wonder, do they really know? The trouble is, you see, that the more we try to explain this to people who've never experienced it, the wilder it sounds. And this stuff gets really far out there. You start trying to explain what happened to you and how it felt, and to try to explain the terror, bewilderment, frustration, and despair, all the things that go with the chronic alcoholic. Try to explain to somebody why you got paid today, you drove down to that crossroad, to your right is the liquor store or the dope man, and to your left is home. And you have every intention of turning left and going home. You get to that intersection, and suddenly, all by itself, your car turns right. You say, what in the hell happened here? Why is this happening? And then, if you're a drinker, you're sitting at the bar after 2 or 3 drinks, and you, why did I do this? What's the matter with me? If you had to go visit your connection, God knows what you're thinking. I don't know too much about that. Only what people have told me. Sounds horrible. It sounds horrible to me just as a full-blown drunk sounds horrible. All of a sudden you're no longer you. You're some kind of a detached protoplasm. Your brain doesn't have enough of a function left to even be able to control its basic activities. What a horrible way to be. And you know, the only thing that the guaranteed result of that is that we we lose a lot of our fear. And that seems to be the bottom line, doesn't it? I got to get rid of this fear. But after a while, we get to a point where it's literally so that we're at that crossroads. To the right is the dope man or the bar. To the left is home. And our brain says, turn right. And we say, yes, sir. And we just do it. And later we can never tell you why. Try to explain that to somebody who's never experienced it. I think you're nuts. Well, of course we are, but it is pure insanity. How do you explain insanity to somebody so they understand what we've been through? So this is kind of an interesting topic, because even people who pick this book up and read it for the first time or even the second time, who have not experienced what we have experienced, are going to find it very difficult not only to understand it, but even to believe it. You see, that's what brings us back full circle. That's why you and I can help when no one else can. Because we have been there, because we have the experience. You see, the big book tells us that our most valuable possession is our past. The experiences of our past. Because those permit us, allow us to hook up with, to be able to work with somebody who will understand us and who will believe us. We have credibility. They know that we know what we're talking about. And then they're looking at us and say, well, gee, maybe there's hope for me too. That's why we can help when no one else can. When you carefully explain to such people that he's a sick person, you'll have created a new atmosphere. Barriers which have sprung up between you and your friends will disappear with the growth of sympathetic understanding. You will no longer be self-conscious or feel that you must apologize as though your husband were a weak character. He may be anything but that. Your new courage, good nature, and lack of self-consciousness will do wonders for you socially. Well, I have to be honest with you, when I read that paragraph, I have grave doubts whether that's going to work all that often. But I suppose it does once in a while. The same principle applies in dealing with the children. Unless they actually need protection from their father, it's best not to take sides in any argument he has with them while drinking. Use your energies to promote a better understanding all around. Then that terrible tension which grips the home of every problem drinker will be lessened. Now there's a big caveat here, isn't there? If this guy is aggressive, if this guy is battering the kids or abusing them in any way, it's got to be stopped. You know, one of the things which I run into all the time in people I work with is their terrible resentment toward the parent who was not the drunk in the family, but who permitted the abuse to go on, winked at it, denied it, backed away from it. Why? Because he or she was so dependent upon the drunk in the family that there was no way they were going to disturb that relationship just to protect the kids. And after all, you were being a brat anyway. And boy, there's a lot of resentment that comes out of that. So I'm not sure that we want to take this too literally. We want to say, don't get in between them if you can avoid it. But if you can't avoid it, if there's abuse, then you're going to have to take sides, and you're going to have to take sides big time. Even up to and including the cops. And it's amazing, you know, how many people have been beaten and battered around their homes all the time when they were kids. This stuff apparently just goes on constantly. I never saw it in my family, but I hear about it all the time. It makes me sick. There's another thing that's really important here, I think, and that is that you and I have learned by being in here that we don't have any damned excuses for that kind of behavior. We can't say I battered my kids because I was a drunkard. We took those kinds of actions knowing they were wrong when we did them. And if you want to hide behind alcoholism or drug addiction as an excuse for the things that you did that you knew were wrong at the time you did them, then you're on a bad path. We're not going to do that. We're going to recognize that these things are our responsibility. We're going to recognize that we had no power over our thinking, but we did not lose power over our actions. Powerlessness doesn't mean that I had no power over my actions. Doesn't mean that I couldn't do the right thing. It means I was powerless over my thinking. It told me I didn't have to do the right thing, and I loved it because I wanted to be able to indulge myself. I made decisions based on self, and self became the ruler. So we got to be careful not to let ourselves get in a place where we're making excuses. We need to look these things right in the eye and say, that was wrong. My actions were wrong. And the only solution is for me to change my actions. Frequently you'll have felt obliged to tell your husband's employer and his friends that he was sick. As a matter of fact, he was tight. Avoid answering these inquiries as much as you can. And why would a wife do that when knowing she is participating? Well, of course, it's probably because she's afraid the husband's going to get fired. He's going to lose the income. And remember, when this book was written, most of the wives did not work. They were entirely dependent upon their husbands to support the family. It's probably more out of fear than out of any concern for the old man. Avoid answering these inquiries as much as you can. Whenever possible, let your husband explain. Oh, you can hear that, can't you? Well, I got a cold. I got the Monday flu. Oh, sure you have, Sam. This is the 4th week in a row you've had flu on Monday and Tuesday. So you've got to keep him off the phone. He's not going to do any good. He's going to lose his job just by what he's going to say. Your desire to protect him should not cause you to lie to people when they have a right to know where he is and what he's doing. Well, I guess you can't argue with that. Discuss this with him when he's sober and in good spirits. And with some guys, that may be never. That'd be true of a lot of us, wouldn't it? Ask him what you should do if he places you in such a position again. But be careful not to be resentful about the last time he did so. Over and over and over again, this chapter repeats the same theme. No anger, no criticism, no pushing, no shoving. Remembering that there's little you can do of your own, and that the best thing you can do is to let this guy have his head and go his course, because sooner or later he's going to do that anyway. Going on page 116 now, there's another paralyzing fear. You may be afraid your husband will lose his position. Now we come to it. You are thinking of the disgrace and hard times which will befall you and the children. This experience may come to you, or you may already have had it several times. Should it happen again, regard it in a different light. Maybe it will prove a blessing. It may convince your husband he wants to stop drinking forever. And now you know that he can stop if he will. This means you know that because you and his wife have read this book. Now he hasn't, but you have, and you know that if he decides that he truly wants to stop for good and all, there's a way for him to do it, as Dr. Bob talked about. Time after time, this apparent calamity has been a boon to us, for it opened up a path which led to the discovery of God. And somewhere along the line, with each one of us, there has come this